public policy, and in 2005, the Texas Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Contribution to Science. His early work as a naval officer and clinical psychologist at the Naval Submarine Medical Center earned him a Navy Commendation Medal for meritorious service. Our speaker earned his doctorate in clinical psychology at Oklahoma State University, and he completed his predoctoral internship at the National Naval Medical Center. His postdoctoral fellowship was completed at Yale University School of Medicine, where he was honored as the outstanding trainee. He now practices nationally as a clinical and forensic psychologist. He's licensed in 17 states and has testified extensively in high-stakes cases, including insanity defenses, where he educated the court about differentiating between delusional disorder and extreme political beliefs, the same topic as his talk today. In fact, the presentation you're about to listen to was developed in response to his work on those legal cases. So I hope I've relayed to you that you're about to hear from one of the most accomplished forensic psychologists practicing today. I appreciate so much his dedication to educating others and teaching the court so that they're better able to make decisions that are based in science. He's a kind person, and I'm proud to call him a colleague. I hope you are too. All right, audience members, please welcome Dr. Mark Cunningham.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that introduction, and I appreciate you taking time from your schedule to attend this conference. The information that I'll provide today, as Julie described, emerge out of my work in cases. Those of you that are familiar with my scholarship know that I'm not in an academic or research institute setting, but for the last 38 years have been a practicing clinical and forensic psychologist. As I've gotten involved in cases and then begun to do research on the issues that underpin those determinations, it has illuminated to me areas of the scholarly literature that could be supplemented and empirical research that could be done to help inform some of these issues. And so that's what triggered my scholarship regarding capital sentencing determinations and violence risk assessments for prison. This is my only foray into diagnostic differentials and emerged in the same way out of my work in these cases. I provide my email, and you should have handouts as well, or can request those from Julie, or can email me, and I'm happy to send them to you. But I'm happy to respond to questions that you may have, and also to provide the article that forms the basis of this presentation. And this is a paper that was published in the Journal of Threat Assessment and Management in 2018. This is an APA journal, and so it's available through that website as well. But if you contact me, I'm happy to send this to you in PDF. And this article is entitled Differentiating Delusional Disorder from the Radicalization of Extreme Beliefs, a 17-Factor Model. I would encourage you, as you utilize these factors, not simply to do so on the basis of this workshop today, which is really kind of an overview and an introduction, but to obtain the article and study it, and from there do some of your own reading and research about these factors. This differential between delusional disorders versus extreme beliefs reflects my view that these are on a continuum from conventional beliefs to overvalued ideas or extreme beliefs to delusional disorder. And this differential is particularly challenging when the delusions have political or social ideology themes. And that's the nature of these most challenging forensic cases that we may be involved in. Now, my mantra in this arena and throughout the forensic work that I do is a quote by Henry David Thoreau. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And so it's my hope that this discussion today, or that the article, when you read that, will prompt you to look at this differential in a broader and more complete fashion, that it prompts you to see more as you look at a case. Now, the workshop elements, we're going to talk about the tale of two cases, Nichols and Monfort. that were the seeds of how this model developed. We'll talk about
Mark,
the history. Yes.
Your slides are not up on the screen.
Oh, no. Okay. So let me go to a shared screen. How about now?
That looks good. We can see, it looks like it's presenter view, as long as you're okay with that.
Okay, well, let me swap the screens and see what that does. How about now?
Perfect. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay,
Sorry
that was a good interruption. I'm glad we did that now and not 40 minutes from now. Thanks.
Exactly, of course.
Okay, all right. So my email is my initials, mdc@markdcunningham.com. Be sure and put the D in the domain name. Again, the article is out of the Journal of Threat Assessment and Management. That we've got a differential of delusional disorder versus extreme beliefs on a continuum, with that differential being particularly challenging when the delusions have political or social ideology themes, and so then are overlapping in these arenas. Our quote by Henry David Thoreau. All right, the workshop elements, we're going to talk about a couple of cases that this model emerged from. The history of delusional disorder, factors that contribute to diagnostic divergence, the concept of extreme overvalued ideas or extreme overvalued beliefs, and to the extent that we can, to dive into this model of analysis, which I have characterized as the MAD or RAD 17. So let's start with to give kind of an overview of where we're going. Now, I haven't given this workshop before, so I have no idea whether I have too little or too much material to present. So in case I've got too much, rather than saving the model until the end, let me kind of preempt that as I talk about how this emerged out of these cases. So as I was first involved in the Brian Nichols case and was confronted with this dilemma and did a search of the literature, there were articles about the history of delusional disorder and about the concepts of delusions, but there was no systematic analysis or tool that I could tap that would help guide how I evaluated or analyzed this differential. And so I identified that there was a need for a structured professional judgment tool that would promote systematic and qualitative analysis, that would encourage a wide-ranging and careful review of empirically and clinically observed factors that illuminate the differential, and that would support testimony and transparency in both the analysis that's in reports as well as in testimony. So in terms of the evolution of this, in response to Nichols, 6 arenas or factors were specified to structure the analysis. And then in response to Monfort, this involved to 8 arenas or factors of analysis. And in the aftermath of that case, with subsequent literature review and numerous extended discussions with an eminent and brilliant colleague, Dr. Steve Golding, these additional analyses emerged. The MAD or RAD 17 emerged from that. And the MAD or RAD 17 reflects 7 arenas or criterion of analysis containing 17 factors. And this is the title of this analysis that the acronym is then based on. The 7 criterion of analysis, to give you an overview, the first one is what is believed, what's the content? The second is how is it believed? What's the cognitive style of the belief? Then what distress or dysfunction is associated with it? What social influences were involved in inspiring or maintaining or operationalizing it to action? To what extent is the belief socially integrated and productive? What about prodromal factors? What indications are there of a developing psychosis that preceded this? And finally, behavioral or activation factors. Is the belief acted on? How is it acted on or exhibited? What disturbance accompanies that action? So those are the 7 broad criteria of analysis that are then disaggregated into 17 specific factors: idiosyncrasy, improbability, grandiosity, rigid adherence, suspension of critical judgment, preoccupation, associated distress and functional impairment, extent of associated social difficulty, interaction with like believers, social motivators, social facilitation and tangible support, social inclusion, prodromal symptomatology, then associated with acting on it, willingness to act on the belief, compulsion to act, rigid moral distinctions in acting on the belief, and psychological disorganization associated with the belief. So 7 criterion or domains reflecting 17 factors. Now, here are some caveats. This is intended to be a structured professional judgment tool. It was conceptually developed from scholarly and empirical literature, but has not been empirically validated. Most importantly, this is not a test that can be scored or a checklist that lends itself to totaling the items is a way of making the differential. Instead, this is intended to be a tool to assist you in thinking about and analyzing the nature and origins and operationalization of these beliefs. All right, so let's talk about our first case. This is State of Georgia versus Brian Nichols. All of the information that you're going to hear was testified to in open court with extensive publicity about it. The trial, including my testimony, was live streamed over the internet. Brian Nichols was on retrial in Atlanta for the rape, kidnapping, and assault of a former girlfriend, a former fiance, in March of 2005. So he'd been through that trial, hung jury, and then several days later, it's going to immediately start over again in front of a new jury. And being taken into court, he overpowered, changing his clothes in an anteroom, he overpowered an escorting officer, took that deputy's keys, opened up a gun locker with it, retrieved a firearm, and shot to death his presiding judge and court reporter. Then fleeing the courthouse, Mr. Nichols fatally shot a sheriff's deputy. Then he took refuge in a residence that was under construction, where he shot and killed the homeowner who came to visit the construction site that evening, and that turned out to be a federal agent. And this case went to trial in 2009. Now, to give you something of the flavor of Brian Nichols and his belief system, these are some quotes from his interrogation at the time of his arrest, several days after the offense. And he says, well, let me just start off by saying that, I give my condolences to all the families of those who were killed in combat. And with that being said, I felt as though the treatment of prisoners in the Georgia state prison system paralleled significantly to that of slavery, the enslavement of people of African descent. And as you know, slaves have a tendency to rebel. And as a result, I felt as though it was my right as a human being, basically, to rebel as a slave. And I felt it was my right to declare war on the United States government. And that's what happened. And as you know, all the persons killed were employees of the United States government. There was no collateral damage. There was no civilian, there was no collateral damage, which sometimes happens in a war. And I think the record should show that, since it is my stance that I was at war with the United States government, that should be noted that there was no civilian damage. Then these are the belief systems that were held by Brian Nichols. Where we're going to be needing to make the differential, is this an extreme political belief, an overvalued belief, or is this evidence, is this delusional and supportive of a delusional disorder? So among his beliefs, number one, a growing conviction and preoccupation that there was a deliberate organized conspiracy directed toward the genocide of Blacks in the United States via incarceration in order to reduce reproductive opportunity. Two, this genocidal agenda has been implemented through systematic discriminate treatment by the criminal justice system and sentencing based on race and skin tone. Three, this agenda serves a multi-billion-dollar industry of prison slave labor. Four, this prison slave industry is controlled by the natural descendants and power inheritors of slave owners. Five, the Fulton County Jail and Fulton County criminal justice system function as a factory for the slavery industrial system and genocide of Black men. Six, Judge Roland Barnes was deliberately staffing the prison slavery system based on race and skin tone. Judge Barnes was one of the victims of these murders. Seven, Mr. Nichols' prosecution, incarceration, jail conditions, and trial were a specific embodiment of genocide and an attempt to literally enslave him. Eight, Mr. Nichols had tapped into the collective memories of generations of enslaved Black men. Nine, by his own singular action, Brian Nichols could change this genocidal prison slavery system. Brian Nichols was the people's champ by his own characterization. 11, by his individual action, Brian Nichols could affect the social realities that his son would one day encounter as an adult. 12, as an individual, Brian Nichols could become a sovereign nation and declare war on the United States. 13, his actions in escaping from the Fulton County Jail and associated violence, including the charged murders, represented a justified slave rebellion and the legitimate application of violence against designated combatants. So that's the belief system of Brian Nichols, that there's a necessity to make a differential about. Now, in terms of his background, he came from an intact middle-class family of origin, college-educated parents. He had a bachelor's degree himself. Had a high-paying tech job earning over $80,000 a year. He'd had a long-term relationship with this fiancée girlfriend who was the subject of the original complaint. He had no mental health treatment history, African-American, and no significant criminal history except for the offense that he was in trial for, which involved a breakup in a relationship with his fiancée, then going to her house, confronting her at gunpoint at the door, forcing his way in, spending a couple of days with her under the idea that if they could just be together and have sex together, that she would then determine to take him back. Along the way in that, he decided, no, this isn't it either, and he simply leaves and is subsequently arrested. He's facing rape and kidnapping charges associated with that, significant prison time. In terms of precursor extreme beliefs, he had beliefs that racial prejudice and bigotry are common among individuals and social institutions in American society. He believed he'd been racially targeted for discriminatory treatment by random people, by educational institutions, and by law enforcement because of his status as an African-American man, and more particularly by the relative darkness of his skin tone. And he's believed that since college, but without strong attitudinal learning, that there is a genocidal or Black population suppression agenda in the criminal justice system. So he's got these ideas, but there's no particular energy associated with them. So there are precursor extreme beliefs. There's the crisis with his fiancée and arrest. And out of those emerge a much more virulent set of beliefs. And of course, the question is, are these delusional in nature? So that's the dilemma. That's the situation that I'm in as I'm involved in evaluating Mr. Nichols and trying to make a differential of delusional disorder versus extreme beliefs. That's the first case. 6 factors emerged out of that. The second case is State of Washington versus Christopher Monfort. This also received extensive media publicity. I was on the stand for about a month in this case because we could only get about 3.5 hours of testimony in per day because of medical issues associated with the paralysis that he suffered from gunshot at the time that he was arrested. Mr. Monfort has subsequently died in prison. So the background of this case, in October 2009, Christopher Monfort firebombed a Seattle police vehicle municipal lot, city maintenance yard. He posted handbills on the cars with statements like, "These deaths are dedicated to Deputy Travis Bruner. He stood by and did nothing as Deputy Paul Sheen brutally beat an unarmed 14-year-old girl in their care." So there was video about this beating that was on the internet. "You swear a solemn oath to protect us from all harm. That includes you. Start policing each other or get ready to attend a lot of police funerals. We pay your bills. You work for us, American citizens." And then he also planted an American flag through the roof of a patrol car. Regarding that action there at the city maintenance lot, he described his thinking before he went to the lot. "I thought about the British and the founding fathers as I loaded the backpack and prepared my weapons. I had a sense of solidarity and connection to the founding fathers. It struck me how far we've come and how little we've gone. Most people have little sense of the connection to the founding fathers or what they did." 9 days later, he assassinated a Seattle police officer and wounded another. He walked up to a patrol car that was parked at the curb, had 2 officers in it, and opened fire, killing one and wounding another. As he drove away from the scene, he dropped a American flag scarf, intending to communicate what was driving this action. When he was apprehended, he was shot and paralyzed. Case went to trial in 2015. Mr. Monfort described a personal obligation to respond to what he characterized as brutal and murderous police conduct. He said, "Standing by and watching them murder is wrong. Knowing about it makes me culpable. If I know about it and I know that I'm responsible to do something about it, then I am culpable." So what are his beliefs? Number one, he had a growing conviction that the police in the United States, and more specifically in Seattle and King County, had departed from the legitimate exercise of their lawful authority and were acting in a tyrannical, brutal, raping, and murderous fashion against the citizenry. 2, the police in their current role function as an officially sanctioned but criminal gang. 3, there are inescapable parallels between the Seattle and King County police, as well as the police in other jurisdictions, and the British Redcoats leading up to the American Revolution, who he believes engaged in widespread pillage, assault, rape, and murder on the American colonial citizenry prior to the American Revolution. In fact, his belief that that was a primary cause of the American Revolution. 4, even those officers who do not themselves engage in criminal assaults against the citizenry, which he thought only constituted about 50 to 55% of Seattle and King County police, are complicit because of their solidarity with the gang and their failure to police their own. 5, the criminal and murderous conduct of police officers represents the gravest threat to liberty and the most serious social problem confronting the United States. 6, it's an essential obligation of the citizenry to resist such tyranny with deadly force, as was demonstrated by the founding fathers and other American colonial citizens. 7, by his own singular action, he would fulfill this obligation and function as a modern Minuteman in rousing the rest of the populace to similar action and throwing off the yoke of police tyranny. 8, only when a sufficient number of police officers had been killed would police departments and district attorneys' offices act to restore the police to behaving lawfully and resuming their legitimate role of serving the citizens. 9, though recognizing that his offense-related conduct subjected him to arrest and prosecution under Washington law, he believed his plans, preparations, and actions in the charged conduct were not only morally right, but also consistent with the higher law of the Constitution of the United States. 10, his offense-related conduct was required of him as an American citizen under the Constitution. 11, thus his offense-related conduct was both morally right and lawful. Now, with both Chris Monfort and Brian Nichols, both of them regarded that what they were doing was the right thing, and even an action compelled of them, given their awareness of what they believed was the social context in which these occurred. This is another feature about these offenders that is unique in that most of the offenders that we deal with in the criminal justice system are aware that they are doing wrong. They know they're robbing people, killing people for their own benefit as an expression of their anger, those sorts of things. There is some sense they have that they are going about misdeeds. These individuals often believe that what they're doing is the right thing and often have histories that are not particularly criminal in nature. And so Chris Monfort, in his background, he came from a biracial family of origin. His mother was white and his father was African-American. He was abandoned by his father, obtained a bachelor's degree, had uneven employment that included even thoughts of applying to an Ivy League graduate school. He did not have long-term dating relationships, had some friends in casual relationships, no mental health history, and no significant criminal history. In his instance, the precursors involve social and interpersonal interactions. And so for some years, he had been insensitive to social cues, opinionated, rigid, rule-bound, idealistic, distrustful of government, intimacy avoidant, not very good coping, easily frustrated and reactive. And out of that context, what are potentially delusional beliefs emerged. And again, that's the differential. So here's another case that involves elements that are familiar to us in terms of police excessive use of force and what measures should be brought to bear to counter that. But a question of whether in the formation that he takes of this, that it represents delusions, excuse me, rather than simply extreme beliefs. Well, there's a model that if you were going in the direction of or trying to explain how this occurred, a narrative of the sequence in Mr. Monfort's life, he's familiar with anecdotal reports of police brutality. He has made a study of the American Revolution. He's a history and political science major in college. And he has an idealization of patriots and the founding fathers. And so there is some development, though, of idiosyncratic ideology that the police are today's redcoats, with a pathological identification of the founding fathers and citizens, which imbues him with a certain grandiosity as well as imperative to act. With forming a belief system about there being a tipping point, that if enough police officers are killed, that's what will make the change in American society. And so there is an irrational and uncritical expectation of what this will do, not that the killing of police officers might in fact result in even more severe action by the police or more support for the police, but rather that's the thing that will turn the situation around, leading to either a delusion or extreme belief inspired right action, which is lethal action in this case. So that's the context, the current or contemporaneous belief systems that have elements that are familiar to us in our society. But the question again of whether, as these are construed and constructed by these two individuals, that this represents a delusional disorder as opposed to extreme beliefs. So let's make a brief pass through the history of delusional disorder. And delusional disorder is a diagnostic classification. So as far back as the early 1800s, Esquirol, and forgive me if I've butchered the French pronunciation, but Esquirol distinguished delusional disorders from the main body of insanity or schizophrenia. And he characterized these as patients with monomania. They were not wholly insane because they were in touch with reality on most things. These were partial insanities. These patients were logical and had accurate memories and a lively curiosity. And where their ideas were odd or eccentric, they supported them by an appeal to evidence. Then Carl Kahlbaum in 1863, he hypothesized that paranoia should be used to specifically distinguish one of the partial insanities that was composed entirely of a coherent, encapsulated delusional system. So Kahlbaum is describing like it's an encapsulated tumor, not a broad illness like leukemia or even having the flu that affects you all over, but instead that there is this encapsulated disorder within an intact sensorium. Then Prevalence, in the early 1900s, German psychiatrist, talked about paranoia being a distinct illness with a chronic, unshakable system of delusions, gradually develops while the presence of mind and the order of train of thought are completely conserved. Again, this encapsulated disorder within an intact mind. So that outside of the delusional system, this person's presentation may be unremarkable. And also that outside of that delusional system, we don't expect them to be stupid or bizarre or inefficient. There's a preservation of mind outside of this encapsulated area. The delusions are largely confined to diseased interpretations of real events. Again, this going to what makes these more difficult to distinguish, that become extended to include events of recent date, and contradictions and objections are recognized and explained. Now, delusional disorder was added as a diagnostic classification to DSM-3R in 1987, and has subsequently been specified in the subsequent revisions regarding this disorder. So delusional disorder, as contemplated by DSM-5, describes a psychotic mental illness that involves holding one or more delusions. So what's a delusion? Well, delusions are fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. In the absence of any other significant psychopathology, never meeting the criteria for schizophrenic, not having predominant hallucinations, although hallucinations may be present if they're related to the theme of the delusion. And the individual can be quite functional and tends not to show any odd or bizarre behavior except when the delusional belief is being discussed or acted on. Again, it's encapsulated. The individual is not going to be odd or bizarre in most instances, except in the area of this encapsulated malignancy. In terms of prevalence, best estimate is that it's about 8-fold overrepresented in a correctional population as compared to the population in the community. Now, there's a caveat, of course, in that persons with delusional disorder in the community may function unnoticed, and they infrequently present themselves for treatment. So that makes it more challenging because of missing cases to know what your true community prevalence rate is. All right, so as we look at making this differential between overvalued ideas or extreme beliefs, there is understandably diagnostic divergence. So in each of the two cases that I described, the defense retained expert diagnosed delusional disorder, and the state retained expert said, no, this is not delusional disorder. These are simply extreme beliefs. So what are some of the factors that contribute to this diagnostic divergence that was illustrated in both of these cases? Well, number one, delusions are the sole distinctive feature in delusional disorder in the absence of other significant pathology. So that makes it more challenging, that you're talking about an encapsulated symptom that is not affecting this individual more broadly. Even when acting on the belief, a mentally ill offender may exhibit planning and rationality. Now, this happens even in schizophrenia, as well as other mental illnesses. That's particularly to be expected in delusional disorder because of the preservation of much of their sensorium. So again, outside of the delusional system, we don't expect them to behave in a stupid, bizarre, or inefficient way. The delusions in delusional disorder may reflect content that's within the realm of possibility. So these are often not bizarre in construction, and in fact are shared to some extent with extreme beliefs. Now, a model that I placed in the paper that I've described is, as we think about this universe of extreme beliefs, those with extreme overvalued beliefs, almost everything that they think is a part of this extremist belief system. Now, the person with delusional disorder also has extremist beliefs, but has many features or aspects of that that are outside of that extremist belief field, but they share some extremist content and themes. Now, this is an important notion that just because a delusion involves a political or social theme doesn't mean that it's an extreme belief. People can have delusions about political issues. The same with religion. Just because it has a religious theme doesn't mean it's not delusional. In fact, very often as people become delusional, they use the content of their culture or even current controversies in their culture to inform the construction of those beliefs. Number four, there is limited scholarly guidance. Now, so for example, DSM-5 says, the distinction between delusion and strongly held belief is sometimes difficult to make and depends in part on the degree of conviction with which the belief is held, despite clear or reasonable contradictory evidence regarding its veracity. I find this not to illuminate much. And it reminds me of the scene in Trading Places where Billy Ray Valentine has just been picked up by the Duke brothers and is trying to figure out what these guys have in mind, and poses the question to the chauffeur of whether or not this is a practical joke or whether they have picked him up for some sexual purposes. And Billy Ray poses the question, what's my next move, man? And the chauffeur shrugs, and Billy Ray says, thank you, you've been helpful. That's kind of where I am with the guidance that DSM-5 provides in this instance, that it really is not much in moving the ball forward. Now, there are delusion rating scales, a whole assortment of those that have been published over the last 40 years. The problem is that these are primarily clinical in focus. They often fail to distinguish between delusional presentations as seen in schizophrenia and those in delusional disorder, and they're not easily applied to a forensic context. And then there are also pressures on forensic objectivity. Now, those include that these offenses are particularly shocking to social consciousness. They disturb our sense of order and safety and reciprocal community. The intense media coverage brings these events psychologically close and then holds them in close psychological proximity for days or weeks. As they're adjudicated, they're subject to particularly vigorous adversarial advocacy. And those are all factors that impact us as experts, as well as impact on the public at large. So those are some additional pressures on forensic objectivity. Now, there's been a proposal in making this differential of extreme overvalued beliefs. And so that's a variation on this theme of extreme ideas. So Rahman and colleagues in 2016, citing some others historically, proposed the concept of an extreme overvalued belief as one that's shared by others in that person's cultural or religious or subgroup. That belief is relished, amplified, defended. The belief grows more dominant over time, more refined, more resistant to challenge, and the individual has an intense emotional commitment to the belief and may carry out violent behavior in its service. Now, my problem with extreme overvalued belief is that a change in terminology does little to advance this diagnostic differential, because delusional disorder also often reflects a biography and personality traits that may grow into delusional states. Almost always delusions share a cultural component. Persons with delusional disorder also seek confirmatory information and ignore contradictory data. And amplification may be manifested in both idiosyncratic features and compulsions to act. Also, in the literature, some of the sources that Rahman cites, the conceptualization of overvalued idea is not limited to reality-based beliefs, but also involves things like believing that your arm doesn't belong to you and seeking surgical removal of it. So clearly the history of this extreme overvalued belief moves into a non-reality zone as well. And finally, that brings us to the need for a structured professional judgment tool that can promote a more systematic and qualitative analysis. Now, as I described in Nichols, 6 areas were identified, refined to 8 in Monfort, then up to 17 in consultations with Steve Golding, so that now we're at these 7 arenas and 17 specific factors. To illustrate, and we'll only have an opportunity to go through just a couple of these in the time that we have, but they're available to you on the handouts, and I would also direct you to the article. But for example, as we look at just a couple of these. So idiosyncrasy as a content of the belief is conceptualized as a continuum where some elements of the belief are not commonly held by others. It's not that there's nothing that this person believes that isn't held by others, but rather some elements are not commonly held by others, and or the integrated totality of the belief is unique. So idiosyncrasy is not considered to be a dichotomous determination of whether anyone else shares any element or theme of the belief. Because by definition, the idea is that some of these will be shared. Improbability is operationalized to mean the extent to which the beliefs reflect historical inaccuracy or erroneous linkage to historical events, or faulty interpretation of current events, or inflated confidence in associated actions having the desired impact. The caveat here is that improbability does not require that the belief be impossible. A similar breakdown and operationalizing of the concept of grandiosity, that it doesn't require the person claim to be someone of special importance. Rather, they describe and exhibit and report special insight into the problem, special recognition of the action needed, perceived right to take the action, expectations of profound influence, heroic identification, publicly claiming responsibility for the act. just a couple more in terms of the cognitive style of the belief and how it's believed. The rigid adherence to the belief despite disconfirming evidence can be examined by looking at 6 different factors. Now, that the person says they're open to disconfirming evidence, of course, doesn't controvert a rigid adherence. So you want to examine what this person actually does with the belief, not what they claim they're open to. In how the belief, how this is believed, there is typically a suspension of critical judgment that can be analyzed through 6 different factors to examine critical judgment. Now, I was instructed to make time for questions. Obviously, we're just on 5 of 17 factors that we might go through. But again, I'm going to direct you to the paper and the handout for additional elaboration of these other factors and give you an opportunity to make some comments or questions. Julie, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I wondered, I suddenly had a panic feeling that maybe I in fact lost this presentation 30 minutes ago, only I didn't know it. So certainly I'm open to comments or questions about this.
Hi, this is Will Wiley here. I'm a PGY2 resident. Thank you so much for giving this talk. It seems really timely. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about QAnon and these bizarre belief systems that have taken root and are actually shared by a large number of people, and how that maps onto the framework that you presented today.
Sure. So as we would look at somebody who is an adherent of that, some of that gets into some of the factors that we are moving toward. So for example, if we just go through these pretty quickly, it may be that the entirety of this person's belief system is shared by other people, and that there are not elements that are unique to them. The improbability of it may be a factor in this. They may not view that they have particular insight. They may in fact be looking to Q as the one who really knows, and they are only trying to absorb and study what they are getting from the ambiguous guidance that Q puts out. There may well be rigid adherence, as well as suspension of critical judgment regarding this. As these people spend a great deal of time with it, they may also show a significant level of preoccupation. By the way, this is Chris Monfort. He drank Applejack liquor because of its association to the founding fathers. This is his apartment at the time he was arrested, and constitutions that he had out on his counter, as well as one in his pocket when he was shot and arrested. But back to QAnon. So some of the ways that you may see a difference here go to social influences, that there is a significant interaction with a community of like believers and significant social motivators that are present, as well as social facilitation and support from that group. And so that's part of the idea of, as you are utilizing this metric, that it gives you a number of different lenses to look through. So to the extent that there is interaction with a community of like believers and social motivators and social facilitation or support, to the extent that those are present, you are less likely to be dealing with a delusional disorder. So that's part of the importance of looking at the totality of these factors as you try to make this differential.
Dr. Cunningham, this is James Fairfax Colombo. I'm a forensic psychologist in the department. So one, I want to thank you for giving this talk. I find this research very interesting. You've also been extremely formative in terms of how I think about risk assessment. So one of the questions that I have is sort of linking some of the lessons that I've learned from you to this. So you were talking earlier about, I'm very familiar with your work on base rates, particularly with the PCLR and institutional violence and capital context. And I always think about grounding something in a base rate. And so here we know the base rate of delusional disorder is extremely low. Because it's extremely low, even though it's overrepresented in the criminal justice population, it's still very low. And so I really like the RAD-17 as sort of the factors you think about when deviating from the base rate. But can you sort of talk a little bit about how, like if I'm facing testimony and somebody's saying, well, this is super rare, so how is it that this person has it? How might I address that? So that was one question. And then I also had a question about if you think there's a role for malingering assessment when it's for a group of individuals who probably aren't going to flag in any malingering measure.
Sure. So let me deal with that second question first. Part of what was interesting with both Nichols and Monfort is that they did not regard that they had a mental disorder, and they adamantly resisted this idea that they suffered from a delusional disorder. If you haven't been able to detect, I was the psychologist that was retained by the defense, and it was my finding in both of these cases that there was a delusional disorder that was driving this conduct. They both insisted that they did not have delusional disorder. Mr. Monfort, who was prone to outburst in the courtroom in the midst of my testimony as I was describing his symptoms of delusional disorder, he shouted out, "Bullshit," which tends to disrupt your train of thought. I don't know if you've ever had that happen. And there was ample evidence in things they had written in interrogation videos, including videos that were taken in the course of the interviews by the prosecution experts, and the extent to which there was kind of a mantra they would fall into about this belief system, where they would use exactly the same words and get on a roll that was hard to interrupt or redirect. And so there was not in neither of these cases was there a serious assertion of malingering. The presentation was, these are things that are authentically believed. What is it that we're believing? What's this about? So I have not had experience with this where where the issue of malingering was a differential that couldn't pretty quickly be put to rest. The other part of the question in terms of base rates, in the article that I describe some research on the incidence of psychological disorder and mental illness among lone homicide offenders who have political or social agendas. And so that gives you some additional sense that it's not an uncommon thing that individuals who are in fact acting alone, as opposed to being directed by an organization of some sort, that lone actors have a significant incidence of psychological disorder. That gets to the base rates in a general sort of way. There may be a paper, and I should have called this up before today, there may be a paper that disaggregates that was published after my article. And the next time I speak on this, I'll make some efforts to retrieve that, because it may give some delusional disorder base rates.
Thank you very much.
Other questions or comments?
Can you tell us the outcome for each of the trials?
Be glad to. So I was on the stand in the Brian Nichols case. I think for a week on direct and maybe a couple of days on redirect, ultimately, as I was being crossed, the prosecutor had a yellow pad that she went through and got to the bottom of it. And after several days, she turned back and asked a question that's very similar to one of the first ones she asked. And the judge said, and I'm trying to recall the name of the prosecutor, I used to know it, but Ms. Jones, we've been listening to Dr. Cunningham now for 8 days. We know everything Dr. Cunningham thinks, except maybe his view on the World Series. So I was on the stand for a long time with this. The jury was out for a significant period of time on the insanity issue. The court observers believed that there was a good chance the jury was going to come back not guilty by reason of insanity. They came back with a guilty verdict in the guilt phase. We're not out at sentencing for very long and returned a verdict of life without parole as opposed to the death penalty. And so it appears, based on that sentencing verdict, that they found compelling this notion that he had a significant mental illness. In the Christopher Monfort case, there was a similar outcome. As I said, I was on the stand for a month. Jury considered the deliberated for a number of days, came back with a guilty verdict, but at sentencing came back within an hour with a unanimous verdict of life in prison. So again, the implication, given the nature of the offense that he committed and the speed of the sentencing verdict, was that they were not ready to acquit him. In both instances, may have had concerns about what would happen if they did and whether he would be at large at that point. But the implication of the sentencing verdicts are that they did find delusional disorder, although I don't have post-trial jury interviews to speak to that definitively. I think there were interviews in the aftermath of Monfort that affirmed that. I don't think I have them regarding Brian Nichols.
Dr. Cunningham, I have another question. I know we're just about out of time, but when you're thinking about delusional disorder and the legal definition of insanity, you had sort of mentioned a lot of people are recognizing that what they might be doing is wrong, but it's motivated by a delusional belief system, but it might not touch on the specific legal elements that you would look for insanity. So do you have any sort of general thoughts on if a delusional disorder could meet that definition?
Well, certainly, and it depends on the standard in the state that you are talking about. In Washington, the standard is whether the person knows that the conduct is wrong, but by subsequent case law, did they know it was wrong under Washington law? And so that's why in the Monfort case, it got into a differential that he thought it was legal under superseding US law, even if opposed to Washington law. And so there was that distinction. In Georgia, it was a twofold issue. One, did he know his conduct was wrong? And two, whether the force of the delusions essentially constituted an overwhelming force that he was unable to resist. So it had a volitional component to it as well. In both of those cases, after the testimony about delusional disorder, there was extensive testimony about how this did or did not comport to the insanity standard in that jurisdiction. We simply haven't had time today to go through that.
Thank you again.
To the extent that most jurisdictions are based on a wrongful knowledge component, as these individuals are in these socio-political cases, in both of these instances of Nichols and Monfort, they both believed that what they were engaged in was the right thing, and was essentially them engaging in a one-man war against what they viewed as an oppressive and unjust social context that required their action in that way. And so they did not regard their conduct as wrong. I appreciate so much your interest and attention and questions as well. It was my pleasure to spend some time thinking out loud with you about this issue, and also, even as I prepared the slides and that kind of thing, causing me to think again about making this differential. So I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you for your
Thank you so much, Mark.
With that, I will log off.